William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison will be president from March 4th, 1841 to April 4th, 1841, approximately 1 month in office. Now, William Henry Harrison was born at the Berkeley Plantation in Virginia Colony in British North America on February 9th, 1773. He was the youngest child of Benjamin Harrison V and his wife Elizabeth Bassett. His father was a Virginia planter who had served as a delegate to the Continental Congress. His father had signed the Declaration of Independence, and for a time his father was the governor of Virginia. After he got out of his private, what we would consider to be secondary school, high school today, he was sent to Hampden-Sydney College for a few years. This was a private Christian school where he studied. It's basically a seminary. But that was never his intention. His intention was to go to medical school. And he did attend about a year and a half of medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. But unfortunately, because both his mother and father died before he turned 20 years old, he was forced to quit. And instead, he decided to take up a commission in the United States Army at the request of Governor Henry Lee III, who is the father of Robert E. Lee. He joined the U.S. Army in 1792 with the rank of ensign. Now, remember, ensign is a naval rank now, but back then he was that was a U.S. military rank. When he first became a member of the Army, he was under the command of General Mad Anthony Wayne, and because of Wayne's volatile behavior, Harrison will quickly move up the ranks. Harrison loved discipline, he loved the military lifestyle, and he saw Mad Anthony Wayne as a hero, and so he will embrace him, and he eventually became his aide-de-camp, which is essentially his right-hand man by 1793. And it's from General Wayne that General Harrison, which he will eventually become, will learn to become a great commanding officer. He helps General Wayne in his decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. But then he gets the bug for politics. And we believe this was about the same time when he married his spouse. He will be introduced in 1794, 1795 time period to a lady by the name of Anna Symes, and they will elope after about 6 or 8 months worth of quote-unquote dating. By the way, this was against the wishes of her parents, who said that he was just essentially, in modern terms, a rich playboy who really wasn't interested in settling down. What's ironic about it is that he became a very big family man and stayed devoted to her throughout his life. Now, in 1799, after he had resigned his commission in the Army in 1797 to become what was essentially the Secretary of the Northwest Territory, he will then become a delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, this is because the Northwest Territory was still a territory, so he couldn't actually be a member of the House. He was just a delegate sent by the territory, which he'll serve from 1799 to 1800. President Jefferson, I believe it was Jefferson, it might have been Adams right before he left office, but he had been appointed also to be the governor of the Indiana Territory, so he left the House in 1801, and he'll take that position until 1812, when the Indiana Territory is begun to be dissolved into modern states like Ohio, Indiana. And by the way, the Indiana Territory does make up Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. Ohio at one time was part of the Indiana Territory as well, but it was spun off as one of the earliest states. And actually, the part that he lived in at the time actually became Ohio. So when he decided to continue into politics, He became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Ohio, where he served from 1816 to 1819. He then took a step back and was a member of the Ohio State Senate from 1819 to 1821. And then he was appointed a U.S. Senator from the state of Ohio from 1825 to 1828. He was also, for a period of time, he was the U.S. Minister to Gran Colombia, which is a historic name for the modern-day country of Colombia. He'll be in that position from 1828 to 1829, essentially. One thing to also remember is his military career does pick up for a while. If you notice, there's some jumping in areas here where you'll see from 1812 to 1816 he disappears for a while. And then from 1821 to 1825 he disappears for a while. Well, that's because he goes back to his military career for a time. He did return to the Army in 1810, this time as a brigadier general. He was in charge of combating Indian uprisings in the Western Territories. He was responsible for the assault on Prophetstown that we talked about, which was called the Battle of Tippecanoe. This made William Henry Harrison a national hero. During the War of 1812, he was in command of a U.S. Army in the American Northwest, mainly around Indiana. Harrison will actually capture the city of Detroit before invading Canada, where he won the Battle of the Thames. But because of a disagreement with the Secretary of War in 1814, General Harrison resigned and left his army position for a period of time. But he would go back and forth during his career. One thing to notice about President Harrison is that when he is elected here in 1840, he is at that time the oldest man to ever be elected president of the United States. And when he arrives in Washington for his inauguration on March 4th, 1841, he wanted everyone to see him as the victor of the Battle of Tippecanoe. He didn't want them to see him as some elderly man. And so even though it was a terribly bitter cold day, I mean, we're talking one of the worst days in American history, he didn't wear his overcoat or his hat during Inauguration Day, even though it was cold and wet and just absolutely miserable. And his inauguration address itself, the speech, was the longest in American history. It was about 8,500 words. It took about 2 hours to give his speech. And then after the speech was over, he then rode in the inaugural parade, again without his coat and his hat, in his sopping wet clothing. So you can tell that this is probably not going to end well for President Harrison due to the fact that he's the oldest man in history to be elected, and he has just spent a freezing cold day out in the rain without any proper clothing to protect him. Now, upon taking office, President Harrison decided there were certain things he wanted to do during his 4 years in office. And many of these were things that would reverse policies of the Jackson and Van Buren administrations. The first thing he wanted to do was to reestablish the Bank of the United States of America. And this was designed to end the panic of the depressions in the late 1830s, early 1840s. He wanted to try to shore up the economy. And another way to do that, he wanted to issue paper currency. And this was a very important part of Henry Clay's American system that he tried to get passed in the late 1820s. So now they're going to try to bring back the American system, not only to invest in infrastructure, but also this time to issue paper currency. Another thing he wanted to do was reverse the patronage system that had been changed under the Jackson and Van Buren administration. He wanted to hire permanent qualified bureaucrats. And he even had a situation where some of his cabinet members came to him and they were upset that he would keep some Democrats in office. They wanted all the Democrats removed and replaced with loyal Whigs. And Harrison proclaimed to them, quote, "So help me God, I will resign my office before I can be guilty of such iniquity." They also tried to countermand his appointment of the governor of Iowa. He wanted to appoint John Chambers to be the governor of the Iowa Territory. And Daniel Webster wanted him to nominate his friend James Wilson, a U.S. representative from New Hampshire. And Webster attempted to press this more and more at each cabinet meeting. And Harrison asked him to read aloud a handwritten note which said simply, quote, "William Henry Harrison, President of the United States." He then announced, "William Henry Harrison, President of the United States, tells you, gentlemen, that by God, John Chambers shall be the governor of Iowa." William Henry Harrison, he didn't want to take away from what the cabinet was advising him to do, but he wanted to make it clear that for certain things he was in charge, and he wanted to clean up this patronage system, and he wanted to have a permanent qualified bureaucracy. Another thing he's going to do is he's going to use the veto power sparingly. He says that he will go back to how President Washington through President John Quincy Adams had used it only for unconstitutional laws. He's not going to use it for bills that he doesn't personally agree with, like Jackson and Van Buren. Another thing he's going to do is he's going to allow Congress to legislate. Jackson and Van Buren were guilty many times of getting involved with Congress and helping them legislate. He goes, no, the people are going to elect a Congress, they will legislate, and I will get involved if absolutely necessary, but Congress should take that measure. Now, Henry Clay had tried to get him to call a special session immediately upon taking office in March of 1841, and President Harrison at first said no. He didn't want to do this because he felt that Congress could wait until their normal session started in December. Now, today, of course, Congress is in session all year. But back then, Congress was only in session from December through March, April, and then they went away for the summer months because Washington, D.C. was built essentially in a swamp, and it was too hot to really have a summer session. So Henry Clay wanted a summer session this year, and eventually his Secretary of the Treasury had to come to him after he said, no, I don't want to do this. Secretary of Treasury Thomas Ewing will come to him and say, look, federal funds are in such trouble that this government cannot continue to pay its bills until Congress gets to its scheduled session in December. So President Harrison will have to relent, and he does on March 17th proclaim that a special session will start for the House and the Senate beginning on May 31st, 1841. So that Henry Clay could begin working not only on his American system, infrastructure, and paper currency, but also for the funding of the government itself. Now, obviously, this special session is not going to happen as scheduled because we will have a change in presidencies. On March 26th, President William Henry Harrison became ill with a cold. He was warned by the White House staff to seek rest. His doctor said that he needed to take a few days off and recover, but William Henry Harrison refused. He had a busy social schedule. He had a steady stream of office seekers who wanted to come and plead their case for appointments to government jobs. And so instead of listening to his doctor's advice to help with this apparent cold, he ignores them and continues working as hard as ever. And unfortunately, within a couple of days, the cold turned into pneumonia. And after it turns into pneumonia, the doctors tried all the contemporary cures. They tried applying opium, castor oil, Virginia snakeweed grass, but nothing seemed to work. And he just continued to decline, and he finally died on April 4th, 1841. President Harrison becomes not only the first president to die in office, but he's also our shortest termed president. He was president for 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. So President William Henry Harrison is now dead on April 4th, 1841. And this brings about the discussion of what we call the Curse of Tecumseh, or the Curse of Tippecanoe. Now, according to legend, Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, places a curse on General Harrison after the Battle of Tippecanoe. And this, it's a apocryphal story. It's not a story that we know to be obviously true, but the legend is that William Henry Harrison and his heirs, in this case political heirs, would die every generation. A generation's about 20 years. And therefore, a period of time, it did seem like it had come true, that this legend or story was true. Because in 1840, William Henry Harrison is elected. He is inaugurated in 1841, dies after a month in office. Then 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. He's reelected in 1864. He is shot and killed at Ford's Theater in 1865. 20 years after that, James A. Garfield is elected president, takes office in 1881, serves for about 6 months. He had been shot in the summer of 1881 and eventually dies in September of 1881. In 1896, William McKinley is elected. He is then reelected in 1900, and he is assassinated in 1901 after he started his second term. Then you have Warren G. Harding, who was elected in 1920. Warren G. Harding took office in 1921, and then, of course, died in office in 1923 of natural causes, supposedly. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first elected in 1932. He would go on to be reelected in 1936 and then reelected in 1940 and 1944. Well, because he was reelected in 1940, supposedly, he is also part of this curse, and he does die after just starting his fourth term in 1945. And of course, the most recent case of this was 1960. John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960 over Richard Nixon. He then took office in 1961, and then he was obviously assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. And this cycle kept going every 20 years until 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. He took office in 1981. Very quickly after his inauguration, he was shot and almost killed, but he did survive, and the curse, we say that the curse was broken. 2000, by the way, George W. Bush was elected, served from 2001 to 2009. There was an assassination attempt against him as well. That was foiled. So, we'll see if it rears its ugly head here and comes back in 2020. This would be the next presidential administration that would see something like this. But from 1840 until 1920, it did seem like every 20 years, whoever was elected would die in office. Obviously, by the way, FDR was seriously ill with polio and other conditions. Harding had heart issues, but, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy were all assassinated. So, but the cycle was finally broken in 1980. Now, as far as President Harrison, sadly, he's a footnote in American history. He has little consequence. The only thing that he has important for him, other than the fact that he's the first president to die in office, he's also the first sitting president to have his picture taken, and copies still exist of that. He is, though, the only president to have a grandson follow him as president of the United States. His grandson was President Benjamin Harrison, who will serve from 1889 to 1893. But the main legacy of the Harrison administration will be that it throws this country into a constitutional crisis. The death of President Harrison sets up a constitutional crisis here in 1841. And the reason why is because when President Harrison dies, it shows the flaws of the Constitution's clauses for presidential succession. The Constitution had stated that the vice president took charge after the death or resignation of the president, but it never actually clarified whether the vice president became the president and fulfilled the remainder of the term, or if he was, quote, an acting president, end quote, and that whether there should be an emergency election held during the next congressional period to fill out the term. Now, the cabinet believed that Vice President John Tyler was now vice president acting as president, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, said that if John Tyler took the presidential oath of office, which is different than the vice presidential oath of office, that he would in fact become the president of the United States. So John Tyler was sworn in on April 6, 1841, and then Congress passed a resolution accepting the presidential succession. This created the precedent that will exist from 1841 through the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, where a vice president, when they succeed at the death or resignation of the president, becomes the president of the United States. Now, after the Kennedy assassination, the government realized that this was not codified in law, and so the 25th Amendment was passed through Congress and ratified by the states in the late 1960s to codify not only what happens for the presidential succession, but also, by the way, once Tyler becomes president, the vice presidency is now vacant, and there's no way to get a new vice president. They just have to rely on the president pro temp, the Speaker of the House, and the rest of the succession. The 25th Amendment will allow the new president to nominate a vice president who could then be confirmed by the Senate. So this is the foundation of the way that we do codify the presidential succession here in the United States of America. John Tyler. John Tyler will be president from 1841 to 1845. Now, John Tyler is born John Tyler Jr. in Charles County, Virginia. He's the son of John Tyler Sr. and Mary Armistead, and he was born on March 29, 1790. He is the first president that was born after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. He will die on January 18, 1862, in Richmond, Virginia, in the Confederate States of America. This makes him the only president in history to not be mourned in the nation's capital because he had an allegiance to a different country. He's also the only president to die outside of the borders of the United States, as Virginia had seceded from the Union at that time. Now, Tyler had gone to college at the College of William and Mary and earned the degree of a Bachelor of Arts, what is today the modern equivalent of Bachelor of Arts. And after he got out of college, he decided to get into politics. And he had a very lengthy political career. He was a member of the United States House of Representatives from Virginia from 1816 to 1821. He then became the governor of Virginia from 1825 to 1827. After he left the governorship, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate, where he served from 1827 to 1836. While in the Senate, he was actually chosen to be the president pro temp of the U.S. Senate, who is the ceremonial officer that leads the Senate when the vice president is not there, and he will be the president pro temp from 1835 to 1836. And then obviously he was elected in 1840 to become the nation's vice president, and he'll serve for about a month in 1841. Now, interesting information about John Tyler in his married life. He married his first wife, Letitia Christian, in 1813, and they had 8 children together, 2 boys and 6 girls. He will have 15 children overall. But unfortunately for him, while he is president in 1842, in September of 1842, Letitia Tyler dies, and the president will be a widower until 1844. But then he'll marry Julia Gardner in June of 1844. Thus, he'll become the first president of the United States to marry while in office. And she would give him 7 more children, 5 boys and 2 girls. What's interesting about this is that their last surviving child, a daughter by the name of Pearl, died in June, on June 30th, 1947. His last child died in 1947. Some of us have grandparents, some of us have parents. My father was born in 1944, who were alive when his last child had died. This was 100 years, 1 week, and 6 days after the death of his eldest daughter, Mary. So it just shows how long the children lasted. And by the way, his daughter Mary was not that young when she died, 100 years before. Another child, by the way, Lyon Gardner Tyler, was born in 1853 and died in 1935. And he had a child in 1928. This child's name is Harrison Ruffin Tyler. Last I checked, he is still alive. I think his brother just recently died, but I believe that he is still alive. And if that is the case, his grandchild is alive 133 or 134 years after the death of President Tyler. So that is pretty remarkable that, he still has, I believe the way it's worded is, he is the earliest president to have a true blood descendant, meaning a child or grandchild that is still alive. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren don't count for that. So he had a very prolific breeding program, so to speak. He was very proficient in that. He did also serve as a captain in the United States Army. So this is kind of the background on President Tyler. One thing that John Tyler will have to deal with in the early stages of his presidency is his relationship with the Whig Party. Now, he had been a member of the Whig Party for a few years before he was elected vice president, but he had been a former Democrat, and even though he did subscribe to many of the Whig policies, he still was nominally a Democrat in many of his views. And when he took the oath of office, he decided to be president, not simply the figurehead that President William Henry Harrison had agreed to. And the issue is that Henry Clay controlled the Whig Party. He never could get elected president, but he controlled the party itself. And Clay had wanted whoever the president from the Whig Party to act as a figurehead and allow him to rule behind the scenes. And President Tyler refused. So congressional Whigs will eventually send President Tyler the American System legislation in the summer of 1841. This was that legislation that Henry Clay had wanted, and President Harrison had said to go ahead and have the special session of Congress. And John Tyler, as president, will veto the bill, and he'll use the argument that it's against states' rights. Clay will push to expel him from the Whig Party. This is the first time in American history that a sitting president has been thrown out of their own political party. The Whig cabinet officials will all resign except for one, Daniel Webster. Webster is in the middle of negotiating a treaty, so he wants to finish that before he leaves, which he does. And John Tyler will replace all the Whig cabinet officials with Democrats. Now, this isn't the only feud that they will have. In 1843, the Whigs, who had been tired of Tyler's independence, will try to remove him from office. They do so through the impeachment process, and they use the argument that he vetoes a tariff bill. The House of Representatives will vote to seek impeachment, and they put former President and current U.S. Representative John Quincy Adams in charge of the impeachment hearings. And although he and the committee believes that President Tyler did misuse the veto, that Tyler did not create a high crime or misdemeanor by doing so, and therefore the impeachment process fails. The first major foreign policy initiative of the Tyler administration will be to negotiate the border issues that had existed during the Van Buren administration during the Aroostook War. And the treaty that comes about is called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and it's signed in 1842. This treaty is negotiated by the U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster and Alexander Baring, the first Baron Ashburton. The treaty will resolve the border issues from the Van Buren administration because they set a definitive boundary between Maine and the Canadian province of New Brunswick. They will settle the issue of the Great Lakes. Who owns the Great Lakes? Well, they come up with the idea that it's a joint occupation between both Canada and the United States. They will also call for both sides to renounce the African slave trade. This is considered the greatest achievement of the Tyler administration, but realistically, it was due to the diplomatic skills of Daniel Webster. So this is the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Next is the Dorr Rebellion. Now, Rhode Island was still using their colonial charter that they had gotten in 1663, and they're using this as their state constitution as late as 1842. And while most states had evolved and given more people the right to vote, by 1842, the state of Rhode Island only allowed white males with property to vote. And because of this, a group led by Thomas Dorr will rebel, and they will seek to install a more democratic constitution. That is going to be their goal. Well, the governor of Rhode Island and the Rhode Island legislature will ask the federal government for assistance. They want federal troops to help put down this rebellion. President Tyler will refuse. Instead, he asks for calm, and he recommends that Rhode Island address the constitutional grievances of the Dorrites. Now, he does promise to send federal troops if an actual rebellion occurs, if violence begins. Well, Rhode Island will begin drafting a new modern state constitution here in 1842, and the Dorrites will withdraw. So this is a major step forward for the state of Rhode Island, and John Tyler had a lot to do with it. President Tyler will also be asked his opinion on the idea of separation of church and state. President Tyler will be asked to weigh in on a debate that Christian groups were having about the legal status of Jews and Muslims in the United States of America. And the question that was being asked is, what are the rights of other religions in the United States? People who are not Christians. Should Jews and Muslims be allowed to worship freely here in this country? And so a group of Christian leaders will go to President Tyler, himself a Christian, and ask, what rights do people like Jews and Muslims have? And President Tyler will respond that everyone has the right to worship or freedom of expression, not just Christians, and this is guaranteed by the United States Constitution within the First Amendment, that First, Congress shall make no law creating an established religion or established church, and that freedom of religious expression shall not be denied. So here is another reaffirmation of the idea that this country is based on freedom of religious expression for all. Another issue that President Tyler will have to deal with is the USS Princeton disaster. Now, there is a ceremonial cruise down the Potomac River in February 1844 for the new USS Princeton, a new sailing cruiser. And when they were coming back to Washington, D.C., the captain of the ship decided to fire one of its big guns called the Peacemaker. And he wanted to fire it towards Mount Vernon to honor former President George Washington. And when they fired this gun, there was a freak accident. There was an explosion, the cannon exploded, and it killed Secretary of State Abel Shore. It killed the Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Gilmer, and it also killed David Gardner, who was the father of President Tyler's new fiancée. He was killed in this explosion as well, and he had been a member, I believe, of the House of Representatives for a period of time. So this was a major disaster for the Tyler administration, but it ends up having a bright side to it because Tyler does order an investigation, and the findings of the investigation will actually lead to new techniques of constructing newer and better cannons in the United States. So there was a slight upside to this. In 1844, we'll have another presidential election. And President John Tyler had tried to retain the presidency, this time running as a third-party candidate. And his campaign platform would be the annexation of Texas. And by the way, he even gains the support of many pro-slavery Whigs and members of the Southern Democratic Party. But after seeing he had little chance of actually winning the election, President Tyler in August of 1844 will drop out of the race. And he doesn't support a particular candidate, although we believe that he was actually behind the Democratic Party. The Whigs will choose at their convention Henry Clay. He was by far the most famous member of the party at this time. Henry Clay had served in almost every different capacity you could think of. He was a member of the House of Representatives, a member of the U.S. Senate. He was a cabinet official in multiple presidential administrations. And so this time he will run, this is his third time running for president. He ran in 1824. He ran in 1832. So this will be the third time's the charm. The Democrats were close to giving the nomination to former President Martin Van Buren. But a letter that had been written prior to the convention where Van Buren came out against the annexation of Texas pretty much led to him not being chosen as the party nominee. The delegates at the Democratic National Convention instead will choose an unknown former Tennessee governor and a U.S. senator by the name of James K. Polk as their nominee. Now, when Polk is notified of his nomination, he showed how little the position actually meant to his personal ambitions. He said, quote, "It has been well observed that the office of President of the United States should neither be sought nor declined. I have never sought it, nor should I feel at liberty to decline it, if conferred upon me by the voluntary suffrage of my fellow citizens." So Polk himself, he's really not wanting to run for president here in 1844, but he feels almost obligated to do so. The New Liberty Party, which was basically a one-issue party, and that issue was the abolition of slavery, will nominate James G. Birney of New York. Birney was a local attorney. He was a former slave owner who decided to free his slaves and somehow saw the light and decided to be, at this point, the nation's, other than maybe Martin Van Buren, biggest advocate for the abolition of slavery. So this will be the three main candidates here in the election of 1844. Now, the election of 1844, the results. Well, the campaign essentially runs like this. Um, James K. Polk will run on a platform of reestablishing the independent treasury of Martin Van Buren. He'll also run on reducing some of the tariffs from the Harrison/Tyler administrations that were passed through Congress, even against the veto of President Tyler. He'll also guarantee that he will try to acquire the Oregon Territory, which we at this time held jointly with the British. We will also try to annex the Republic of Texas as a state. And he also hopes to purchase Alta California on the West Coast from Mexico. So that is his platform for a potential Polk presidency. Henry Clay, at this point, he is running for president for, I think, the second or third time at this point. And his campaign platform, it was the third time he ran in 1824 and 1832. His campaign platform is the same as it had been over and over again. He is running on the American system. He's running on infrastructure reform. And he's also talking about anti-expansion. He does not want to see the South the South or the North extend any further west. It's just causing sectional problems, and they just don't want to deal with it. James Birney of the Liberty Party, obviously, he's a Northern abolitionist. He believes in doing away with slavery. Ironic, he was a former slave owner himself. So he will run on a platform of abolition of slavery. He wants to do away with slavery altogether. And when the results come down, depending on which book you look at, numbers fluctuate because of the way they round things up and down. But popular vote-wise, James K. Polk gets about 1.3 million electoral votes, between 1.337 and 1.339. That's good for approximately 50% of the popular vote. Clay gets about 1.2 million popular votes, which is good for about 48%. And then Birney gets 62,000 popular votes, which is good for about 2%. So it's very close between James K. Polk and Henry Clay. As a matter of fact, Henry Clay probably would have won this election, but he lost crucial votes in the North to Birney because of Birney's stance on slavery. The North was at this point becoming very abolitionist. And so, by the way, New York was won by Polk. If you look at this map, New York was won by James K. Polk. This was the home state of former President Martin Van Buren, and Martin Van Buren put heavy weight on the state of New Jersey to vote for Van Buren, or for Birney, because of his anti-slavery stance. By the way, also immigrant voters cost Clay many votes because of the Whig Party's stance on immigration, which was, ironic because Henry Clay himself actually embraced the idea of immigration, but the Whig Party itself was so vehemently opposed to immigration that it led to Henry Clay losing a lot of votes. And this was going to be a big deal in places like New York City. Polk, by the way, he lost his home state of Tennessee. He also lost North Carolina, where he went to college, but he still won the presidency. It's rare for a candidate to lose their home state and win the presidency. The last example of this was, or is actually Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost his home state of New York, but won the presidency. But let's be honest, he was also running against someone who also, her home state was New York, and that was Hillary Clinton. So in that case, the winner, the loser or the winner, someone had to win the state of New York in that case. So now James K. Polk will be the next president of the United States. The election of 1844 brings up again the idea of the annexation of Texas. This was one of James K. Polk's campaign platforms that he ran on in 1844. And it's no secret that the Republic of Texas had petitioned the United States for entry as a state since it gained its independence from Mexico in March of 1836. There's this belief out there that the Republic of Texas had wanted to be an independent country. They were an independent country by default because Presidents Jackson and Van Buren refused to allow entry. Both were afraid of a war with Mexico over the annexation of Texas. President Harrison, during his short time in office, was vague, very quiet on the issue. Most believed he probably was for annexation, but he never made his true feelings known. Now, President Tyler had supported Texas annexation since 1843. He even went so far as to have his administration negotiate an annexation treaty with the Republic of Texas in 1844. The problem is that the Senate has to ratify all treaties by a 2/3 majority, and the U.S. Senate refuses to do anything for President Tyler. And when the election of 1844 happens and Polk, the pro-annexation candidate, is elected, John Tyler decides to use the election as an excuse to annex Texas himself. So what he will do is he will essentially submit an annexation bill to Congress instead of a treaty. And he will do this by what's called a joint resolution. Theoretically, this is only supposed to be done for funding and spending. But he found wiggle room around and decided he was going to bring Texas in this way. And both the House and the Senate will agree to this. They agree to it on February 28th, 1845. By the way, that's just 5 days before President John Tyler will leave office on March 4th, 1845. The Texas voters will agree to a state constitution in October of 1845. That constitution will be agreed to by the U.S. Congress, and Texas would join the Union on December 29th, actually, 1845. Now, just some last-minute stuff about John Tyler. John Tyler became the first president, by the way, to have a veto overridden. There was a bill about revenue cutters and steamships that he vetoed, and both the House and the Senate overrode his veto with a 2/3 majority in both houses. That happened on March 3rd, 1845. After he left office and the inauguration of James K. Polk, John Tyler returned to his plantation, which he eventually renamed Sherwood Forest. He did that to signify that he had been outlawed by both of the political parties. He, for the most part, refused to be involved in electoral politics, although people did come and ask him for his advice on occasion. He was also an advocate for states' rights and for slave ownership. So it's obvious that during the secession movement of 1860 and 1861, President Tyler would support the Confederacy or the Southern states. Tyler was actually elected a delegate to and president of the Peace Conference or Peace Convention in Washington, D.C. in 1861 that was supposed to prevent the American Civil War, but obviously that was unsuccessful. He was also selected as a delegate to the Provisional Confederate Congress in 1861. He was afterwards elected to the Confederate States House of Representatives in late 1861, but he will die of bronchitis on January 18th, 1862, before he took office. As I said before, John Tyler's death is the only one in presidential history to not be mourned in our nation's capital. This was obviously because of his allegiance to the Confederate States. And because the state of Virginia had seceded from the Union and therefore was technically no longer part of the United States, President Tyler is also the only American president to die on foreign soil, in that he died in the Confederate States of America. James K. Polk. James Knox Polk was President of the United States from 1845 to 1849. He was born on November 2nd, 1795 in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. He was the son of Samuel Polk, a slave owner and farmer surveyor, and Jane Knox, the descendant of the brother of the Presbyterian Church, John Knox. The family relocated to Tennessee in 1806. Unfortunately, Polk suffered from many childhood illnesses, the most severe of these being a urinary stone infection in 1812, which we believe may have left him sterile. He did attend Murfreesboro Academy from 1814 to 1816, and it's here that he'll meet his future wife, Sarah Childress. They were both teenagers at the time. He then was accepted into the University of North Carolina in 1816. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts with honors in 1818. He then returned to Tennessee where he studied the law. He passed the bar in 1820. From 1819 to 1822, he served as the clerk to the Tennessee State Senate. He then joined the local militia in 1822. He eventually got the rank of colonel. Polk was also elected to the Tennessee State Legislature in 1823. In 1824, a now 28-year-old James K. Polk married a 20-year-old Sarah Childress. They will have no children due to the previous medical condition. Polk would then serve as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Tennessee. He'll serve from 1825 to 1839. During his time in the House of Representatives, he was even elected Speaker of the House. He'll serve as the administrative head of the House of Representatives from 1835 to 1839. After he leaves the House of Representatives, he becomes governor of Tennessee. He'll serve as governor of Tennessee from 1839 to 1841. James K. Polk, by the way, is the first Speaker of the House to win the presidency. Also, when he wins the presidency in 1844, he was 49 years old. At the time, he was the youngest man ever elected to be president of the United States. Prior to his presidency, and during his presidency, he was called Young Hickory, alluding to the fact that his mentor was President Andrew Jackson. He was also referred to as the Napoleon of the Stump. He was known for having great oratory skills, so people looked at him very highly for his speaking abilities. The Oregon Territory. Since 1818, Oregon Territory was controlled jointly by the United States and the United Kingdom. And previous administrations had tried to split the territory in half along what's called the 49th parallel line. But the British refused to do this, and the reason why is they did not want to lose access to the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, the Democratic Party's platform called for the annexation of the entire Oregon Territory, but President Polk was willing to compromise. So what he does is he sends a delegation to negotiate splitting the territory again along the 49th parallel line. But the British again refuse. So what Polk does is he breaks off negotiations, and he'll send the British a termination of joint occupancy agreement letter, meaning that now this territory is up for grabs, and Polk will call for military volunteers, and he'll say, essentially, the rallying cry will be 54-40 or fight, meaning instead of splitting it on the 49th parallel line, which is half and half, they're going to take it all, which is the 54 parallel line. Well, the British decide that this is too risky. They don't want to fight a war over it, especially because they might be able to get a deal with the Americans. So what is decided will be called the Oregon Treaty, and the Oregon Treaty will be signed on June 1846. And Secretary of State James Buchanan will negotiate this with the British envoy to the United States, Richard Parkingham. And they agree to split the Oregon Territory along the 49th parallel line. So they split it right in half. The only exception is Vancouver Island. That will remain part of Canada. But here is where the important thing stays, is that the British would retain their shipping rights on the Columbia River. That was, of course, the reason why they weren't fond of the idea of giving up any part of the Oregon Territory to begin with. So James Buchanan had 4 or 5 campaign promises. The first one was already taken care of by President Tyler, and that's the annexation of Texas. Now, check number 2, he has now gotten the Oregon Territory. Another area that the Polk administration was interested in was the island of Cuba. Now, Cuba was property of the Spanish Empire here in the 1840s, and President Polk authorized his U.S. ambassador to Spain, Romulus Mitchell Saunders, to attempt to purchase Cuba for the United States. Spain was offered up to $100 million to sell Cuba to the United States. But the problem was the plan, although it was very popular in the South because Cuba had slaves, the people in the North did not want this to happen. They feared that this island would be split into up to 5 new slave states, which would ruin the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. It didn't matter anyway. Spain refused to sell. They were not interested in selling Cuba at this time. Spain saw the profit for sugar, molasses, rum, and tobacco was just too much. They couldn't afford to get rid of Cuba at this time. Now, they will lose Cuba in 1898, but they will keep it approximately another 40 years. Now, the domestic affairs of President Polk. First, the Walker Tariff of 1846. Congress will pass a bill that substantially lowered the tariff rate that had been set by the Tariff of 1842. This was highly popular in the South and the West, which were anti-tariff, but it was very much unpopular in the North, especially Pennsylvania. They wanted to protect their businesses from foreign competition. At the same time, the independent treasury, which had been abolished by the Harrison/Tyler administrations because Van Buren never got it fully funded, Congress will pass a bill that restores the independent treasury. This time, though, it will allow the Treasury Department to oversee and to hold government funds. It also will create a deposit office in many areas to receive government funds. You also had the Wilmot Proviso that will be debated in Congress in 1846. This is proposed by Congressman David Wilmot in August of 1846, and this proposal would outlaw slavery in any future acquired territory, aka the territory taken by the Mexican War. The bill will pass the House of Representatives, but is blocked by the Southerners in the U.S. Senate. He will reintroduce this bill in February of 1847. It will again pass the House of Representatives and again will be blocked in the United States Senate. Congressman Wilmot will then try to get it added into the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as an amendment in 1848, but this will also fail. And shortly after this, Wilmot will leave the Democratic Party. He joins the anti-slavery party called the Free Soil Party. So you begin to see the fractures in the Democratic Party here over the slavery issue. There will be 3 states that join the Union under President Polk: Texas in 1845, Iowa in 1846, and in 1848, the state of Wisconsin. One of the last acts of the Polk administration is the creation of the United States Department of the Interior. Now, this will be the first new cabinet position created since the founding of the American Republic in 1789. President Polk will sign this bill into law, creating the Department of the Interior on March 3rd, 1849, but it will be his successor, President Zachary Taylor, who will appoint the first Secretary of the Interior. The United States Department of Interior is essentially going to be the catch-all for the federal government. Prior to this, the catch-all was the Department of State. At the beginning of American Republic, there was some talk about creating a Department of Domestic Affairs. And even though there was a vigorous debate, they decided to give that power to the Department of State. The Department of State today, of course, is obviously mainly about foreign policy. You know, they are the foreign ministers. But at the time, they had a lot of wide-reaching domestic powers as well. So the thought was to take some of the work from the Department of State and create a new department to handle these things like land, federal lands and federal natural resources. But you also had things like the General Land Office, which was part of the Department of Treasury. The Department of Treasury is financial. Why does it have the General Land Office? The Indian Affairs Office, that was part of the Department of War. Today we'd call that the Department of Defense. This probably would belong better with a Department of Interior. Same thing with the U.S. Patent Office. The Patent Office, deals with American inventions. Why is this part of the Department of State? So President Polk will advocate for this and sign this into law, and beginning on March 4th, 1849, you see the beginning of the U.S. Department of the Interior. This is, again, as I said, the first new cabinet position created since 1789. This is a picture of President Polk's cabinet in 1846. It was taken in the White House dining room. This is not only the first photo that was taken in the White House, it's also the first photo of a presidential cabinet. And you'll see President Polk is the third from the left. Now, President Polk entered the White House full of enthusiasm, vigor, and excitement. When he left office in March of 1849, his health was in serious decline. He had lost weight, he had deep lines across his face, dark circles under his eyes. And when he left office, while he was on his way home, we think he may have contracted cholera. We know that he was on a very busy schedule, traveling from Washington, D.C. south. He was banqueting and visiting with people. He did stop off. I can't remember exactly where he stopped off. It's somewhere down south. I believe it was Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken. It was either Alabama or Louisiana. I think it might have been New Orleans, actually, but I'll have to check that. But he was down south on the Gulf Coast because he had traveled from D.C. by riverboat along the East Coast, the Atlantic seaboard, around Florida, and into the deep South. And we believe that it was cholera because it was prevalent in New Orleans and in Mobile area at the time. And we do know that a passenger on James K. Polk's riverboat did die of it. So obviously that's why we believe that to be the case. People were worried about his health, so he did leave the city of New Orleans quickly, although he was just overwhelmed by the Louisiana hospitality. A few other people on that same riverboat did die of cholera, and Polk at one point felt so ill that he went ashore for about 4 or 5 days and stayed in a hotel. A doctor assured him that he didn't have cholera and sent him on his way to make his final leg of his voyage. arriving in Nashville, Tennessee in April of 1849. Just about 2 or 3 months after he leaves office, he dies at his home Polk Place on June 15th, 1849. It was just about 3 months after leaving office. His retirement, by the way, is the shortest in American history. He had left office, and then he died 103 days later. At his death, he was also the youngest ex-president to die in retirement. He was 53 years old. He was survived not only by his mother, James Knox Polk, but also his wife, Sarah Childress Polk. She lived as a widow for 42 years. She died on August 14th, 1891. She was 87 years old. Sadly, today there are pictures of his home, which I'll include on this PowerPoint, Polk Place, but it no longer exists. It was demolished in 1901. Now, President Polk is remembered by historians as one of our better presidents. Even though he was only a one-term president, 4 years, he set campaign goals, and he accomplished all of them. And then he chose to retire rather than seeking another term. Some do not give him enough credit for being president because he only served one term. But many people fail to remember that he voluntarily stepped down. He did not get voted out of office. So James K. Polk is probably our most successful one-term president, and he is highly rated by historians, who see him as the embodiment of what a politician should be. Run on a platform, get the platform done, and then step away.